Hey there, welcome to the Lore to Death podcast, a deep dive into the lore of your favorite games, movies, shows, and more. My name is Brett, and today I want to finally continue the story that we started ages ago in our episode about Jergal and talk about the Dead Three, whom I would consider to be the main antagonists of Baldur's Gate 3. This will be the story of three mortals who dared to ascend to godhood, their misdeeds, and the answering of the question, why are they called the Dead Three? Just so that you're aware, at the top of the episode, this will contain full spoilers for the plot of Baldur's Gate 3. I mentioned that I would consider these gods to be the antagonists of the game, and there's no way to tell that story without directly talking about the plot of the game. So if you haven't quite finished the game, go ahead and wrap up your playthrough and then come back to this episode. It's going to explain a lot of things about the game that I personally know that I wanted to know while I was playing, and I hope it wraps things up nicely for you as well. And before we get started, I just want to ask that you rate this podcast 5 stars wherever you're listening to it, or like and subscribe if you're on YouTube. The only way that I know that you're enjoying the content that I'm making is if you let me know. So rate the show, leave a comment, or send an email to lordtodeath@gmail.com to suggest an episode or just say hi. So with that out of the way, let's get on with the episode. And what a better way to start than all the way in the beginning? Centuries before the Dale Reckoning, there lived 3 adventurers: Bane, the tyrant, Bhaal, the assassin, and Myrkul, the necromancer. Unfortunately, we know next to nothing about them during this time, save for some information about Myrkul, whose full title was Myrkul Bey al-Kursi, the Crown Prince of Myrkul. So while we don't really know anything about Bane or Bhaal, we know that Myrkul had a royal lineage, which would seemingly set him up for life with whatever he might have needed. And we also know that Myrkul was full of mages, so it makes sense that Myrkul was also a powerful mage and a necromancer to boot. These 3 adventurers, assumedly clothed in the riches of Myrkul, made a pact that they would ascend to godhood or die trying. And of course, what better portfolio to go after for a group of assassins, tyrants, and necromancers than the portfolio of death held by Jergal, the Lord of the End of Everything? And so the 3 would travel around Faerûn doing quests and gaining power over time until they felt like they had what it took to take on the god of death himself. And I really wish that there was more information about this time, because I feel like there's so much that we're missing. Who exactly were these 3 adventurers? How did they meet? And why did they suddenly set their sights on godhood? We might never know the answers to these questions, unfortunately, but we have a pretty detailed account of what their adventures were past this point. So much so that we have a date that we can put them in -357 DR, in which the 3 adventurers would decide that they were almost ready to take on the god of death, and started to marshal an army to help them get to his fortress, the Castle of Bone in the Grey Waste. This alliance consisted of several unlikely champions, such as Wizards of Bars, the Peoples of Varum, Gnolls of Flindyke, Goliaths of Okoro, and Gnomes of Forharn. I say that this is an unlikely alliance because the peoples that were gathered here were from all over the place, and it consisted of many races and groups of different people who would have never really bothered with each other otherwise. It's not to say that they were enemies per se, but it must have taken some seriously good rolls from the adventuring party to get them to agree to slay a god together. But in order to slay the god of the dead, or at least take his portfolios, they needed one more thing, because you can't just wake up on a Tuesday morning and decide to kill a god unless you're a high school student in an anime series. So what they needed was a shard of divinity to give them an extra edge and the first step to godhood. So with their army in tow, they headed to the frozen forest at the base of the giant glacier in northern Faerûn, where Merum, the Broken Spear, one of the 7 lost gods, was currently residing. Merum was an ancient primordial who had been enlisted by the agents of Netheril to fight in the 7 Sigils War a century earlier, but escaped their control and was hiding in the frozen forest. In the end, the group was successful in slaying Merum, and Bane, Bhaal, and Myrkul all took a piece of their divinity for themselves. This bolstered them, but it did not give them any divine powers, so for the moment, they were still mortal. But it did give them enough to finally seek the Grey Waste in search of the Castle of Bone, where they would hope to find Jergal and steal his godhood. There they fought through waves of skeletons, zombies, and various undead creatures controlled by liches, which seemingly had no end. But eventually they succeeded, and were granted access to the Castle of Bone and the Bone Throne that Jergal sat on. And I know I made the same joke in my Jergal episode, but Bone Throne, the Throne of Bone, it's just too good. It's too good not to mention. Without any formalities, the three adventurers claimed that the throne was theirs by right since they had gotten this far. "I claim this throne of evil," shouted Bane the tyrant. "I'll destroy you before you can raise a finger," threatened Bhaal the assassin. "And I shall imprison your essence for eternity," promised Myrkul the necromancer. But assumedly since they saw that there was only one throne, they started bickering with each other. See, as much as they had been adventuring together for an untold number of years, they were still a group of evil dudes who were in it for themselves. It sounds like because of their nature, they were always pitting against each other and constantly in a state of arguing. Jergal, however, was like my dad whenever I asked him if it was my turn on the Xbox, and let out an exasperated sigh and said, "The throne is yours. I have grown weary of this empty power. Take it if you wish. I promise to serve and guide you as your seneschal until you grow comfortable in the position." Jergal was also looking for a change of scenery, as it turns out, and willingly gave up his portfolios. However, there could only be one god of death, so Jergal offered to give it to one of the three members and be their coach while they were getting used to the position before retiring. This, of course, started another fight between the three, and they quarreled over who should be the one to sit on the Bone Throne. Jergal, already tired of their fighting, intervened lest he be trapped in this moment for eternity, waiting for everyone in the room to die of exhaustion. He said, "After all you have sacrificed, would you come away with nothing? Why don't you divide the portfolios of office and engage in a game of skill for them?" To which the three agreed that this was a fair compromise. And playing for the portfolios in a game of skill would mean that the best man would come out on top. The game was that of skull bowling. Jergal gathered the 3 skulls of his most powerful liches and gave one to each of the 3. The goal was to roll a skull across the Grey Wastes, and whomever rolls the furthest wins. Whether by coincidence or not, Malar the Beast Lord happened to arrive to visit Jergal at this very moment, and learned of the mortals who were competing to take his portfolios off his hands. The 3 adventurers, having already bowled their skulls already, were already engaged in a game to take the portfolios, and Malar would not have that. He chased off after the skulls and halted them and the game until he was considered for their role, since he apparently wanted to be the god of death as well. I mean, who doesn't? Gods are always looking to expand their portfolios anyways. Of course, this sparked another argument between the 3 about how Malar had ruined their sport, and Jergal was forced to intervene again. "Why don't you allow Lady Luck to decide so you don't have to share with the beast?" Jergal asked. And the trio agreed to this. Better that than having to fight a god in a rigged game of skill only to lose. And best to do it while Malar was off chasing the skulls and not around to participate in their game of luck. So Jergal broke off his skeletal fingers and gave them to the 3 adventurers so they could play a game of knucklebones. Thankfully for the 3, they had finished their game before Malar returned, and by the time he got back, they were already being awarded their portfolios. He was furious, but what could he do against the god of death? He was a mere lord of the beasts and held no contest. Bane won first place, Myrkul second, and Bhaal third. Bane, already being called the Tyrant, decided that he would take the portfolio of Tyranny. "As winner, I choose to rule for all of eternity as the ultimate tyrant. I can induce hatred and strife at my whim, and all will bow down before me and my kingdom," he said. Myrkul, being in second, declared, "But I choose the dead, and by doing so I truly win, because all you are lord over, Bane, will eventually be mine. All things must die, even gods." This also makes sense for Myrkul, being a necromancer, that he would choose to be the god of the dead. That, and it seems like being the god of the dead was the overall goal for the 3 anyways. The fact that Bane didn't choose it seems like a missed opportunity, but he seemed happy nonetheless. Bhaal technically lost the game, but he still made it out with a good portfolio. He stated, "I choose death. and it is by my hand that all you rule, Lord Bane, will eventually pass to Lord Myrkul. Both of you must pay honor to me and obey my wishes, since I can destroy your kingdom, Bane, by murdering your subjects, and I can starve your kingdom, Myrkul, by staying my hand. And Bhaal thus became the god of death. I think it's a good idea to make the distinction between Bhaal and Myrkul. However, Bhaal chose to be the god of death, while Myrkul chose to be the god of the dead. Dead and death are two different things, and it took me a minute to realize the difference myself. Being the god of death is typically looked at as being the god of murder, as Bhaal would be more known as. And I think that god of murder is a better way of looking at it. Meanwhile, being the god of dead meant that Myrkul was essentially the Grim Reaper. He presided over the domain of the dead, and more importantly, was the embodiment of the fear of death, whereas Bhaal was more like the act of being murdered or just dying itself. I'm not really sure if I can put it into better words myself, honestly, but I hope that makes some sense. And so the three became the gods of their respective domains. Jergal assisted Myrkul as his seneschal while he was getting into the position, and Malar was left to pout in the corner because he wasn't allowed to have a horse in that race. So he left and continued presiding over his beasts. So now that we know how they became gods, I think it's worth talking over each of the three individuals, going over their personalities, worshippers, all that good stuff. And then we can go into their history as the Dead Three and find out why they were referred to as such. So let's just go in the order that we've been mentioning them this entire time, not that it particularly matters. We'll go Bane, Bhaal, and then Myrkul. Bane was known as the Faerunian god of tyrannical oppression, terror, and hate. He was referred to as Lord Bane, the Lord of Darkness, the Dark One, the Black Lord, the Black Hand, and Bane the Accursed. I think that most people referred to him as the Black Hand, and he ruled from his divine realm, the Black Bastion, which could be found in Avalas, the first layer of Archeron, while his home plane was Banehold, also known as the Barrens of Doom and Despair. And as you might expect from someone with that excellent introduction, Bane was recognized as lawful evil. To this end, he was wholly malevolent and tended to distance himself from other mortals, whom he looked down upon. Because of this, he tended not to deal with his worshippers face to face very often, and didn't favor being summoned directly. Instead, he tended to rule from afar and focused on instilling as much terror in the hearts of mortals, whether they followed him or not, and used that hatred as fuel to gain greater control over the realms. And you might be wondering, as someone who used to be a mortal themselves, why did Bane hate mortals so much? And that's because he was a big, stupid egotist just like the rest of his ilk. As we know, the Three's plan was to become gods, and so once Bane had achieved that end, he thought himself as better than everyone because he was essentially able to pull off a zero to hero. He was an extremely ambitious individual who believed that the strong had the duty and the right to rule over the weak. And so, now that he was a god, he felt like it was his place to make sure everyone knew that he was much better than them. That being said, he did have respect for those who seemed to share the same drive as him. He favored those with courage and the drive to be the change that they wanted to see in the world when it pertained to doing it for personal gain or for the sake of inflicting pain on others, like gaining new territory or taking territory from others. It would seem that he was also a large proponent of slavery, as his teachings were largely used in places that were under a dictatorship or had rampant slave trades, as those two themes kind of fit into his strong over the weak mentality. When he was summoned, he had a dark and shadowy appearance and appeared as though to be wearing armor made of shadow, along with his iconic gauntlet, which he wore on one hand. He had no favored weapon, just the gauntlet, which he used to punch his way through the opposition while occasionally being accompanied by a raven named Caravis. Interestingly, Bane was also individualistic when it came to dealing with other deities as well. Since he wanted to be the best around and no one's ever going to keep him down, he tended only to make alliances that were certain to work out in his favor, or make thin promises that he could easily break later for his own gain. The only real exception to this was with Myrkul, whom he had a long-standing alliance with since they began adventuring together. It doesn't say it outright, but it doesn't specifically mention Bhaal in this. It seems like Bhaal was looked down upon in the group. Bane in particular seemed to loathe Bhaal And there are even sources that state that Bhaal was actually a servant to Bane and was under his thumb rather than standing with him as an equal. Other than Myrkul, though, Bane had working relationships with Loviatar, the goddess of agony, Talona, the goddess of poison and disease, and Mask, the god of shadows and thievery. But of course there were no alliances without making enemies, of which Bane had plenty. Most notably on the naughty list was Mystra, the goddess of magic, whom Bane hated because of the power that she held. Being an evil god, he also hated the Triad, which consisted of Tyr, Ilmater, and Torm, 3 lawful good deities for reasons that we'll get into later, along with Cyric, who was right up there with his hatred for Mystra. Bane's worshippers, called the Baneites, were much like he was, just the worst sorts of people. But there was a merit to his church. Among the evil gods, Bane's church was said to be the most stable, despite his entire mantra being based around power struggles. You would think that there would be plenty of infighting, but his followers tended to settle their disputes through debates rather than shows of force, which made for a relatively constructive atmosphere. That doesn't mean it was a great place to be, though, and being a member of his clergy was just as strictly structured as most other gods. But everything centered around power, like I mentioned, and so Bane was at the center of all things, and his worshippers were willing to give their lives at a moment's notice if he willed it. So they were nothing if not entirely subservient. There were no calendar holidays under Bane, but instead gratitude was shown by ritual torture and sacrifices in the name of their god, and their holy symbol was the Black Hand of Bane. They would pray at midnight for their spells, pledging full loyalty to Bane, knowing full well that the penalty for disloyalty was death. His cleric could be recognized by the black enameled gauntlet worn on one fist, symbolizing Bane's own weapon, which was just the same. Other than being pugilists, his followers were given extra power when casting spells against the undead, having a greater effect against lesser undead, ghouls, and phantoms. And that's pretty much all I really have to say on Bane for now, so let's move forward to Bhaal. Bhaal was simply known as the Lord of Murder or the Dreadlord. I respect that he's a god who doesn't have like 16 different titles, but he was also known as, and I know I'm going to butcher this, Ninjushigampo amongst his Gugari worshippers. He was the Faerunian god of violence and ritualistic killing, and he ruled from the throne of blood on Kalas, the first layer of the outer plane of Gehenna, and was depicted as neutral evil. Bhaal lived for the thrill of the hunt and lived only to kill, which was fitting for an assassin, I would say. He was a very cruel, violent, and hateful being, and even the mere presence of the living would cause him to go into a frenzy, and he was liable to kill everyone around him. Being neutral evil, his behavior went from cold, calculating, and ruthless to a complete savage, whose only goal was to shed blood by any means necessary. Bhaal had 3 different avatar forms: the Slayer, the Ravager, and Khazgoroth. The Slayer resembled a humanoid male's corpse with ivory skin that had deep lacerations, and he would take this form in urban areas. However, as we see in Baldur's Gate 3, the Slayer is depicted as a 4-armed bipedal beast with a long tail, spikes all over its body, and far too many teeth. This is the form that Orin takes during her fight, or the form that the Dark Urge can take later in the game, considering that they were both Bhaal spawn. I believe there's a difference in descriptions for the Slayer because the first one, the human male, is Bhaal's own avatar, while the Slayer that you can transform into in Baldur's Gate 3 is an aspect of Bhaal, so technically not his actual avatar, but a depiction of it. But it's still noted as his avatar, so I just want to put that out there. The Ravager was a giant monster said to be 30 feet tall with a flowing beard and mane, with glowing eyes that held the fires of Gehenna, and from its forehead protruded 2 7-foot-long horns. This was the form that he would take in rural areas. Khazgoroth was simply a shape-shifting monstrosity that took the form of any terrifying creature like a T-Rex. This beast was born from a moonwell corrupted by Bhaal called the Darkwell in 1345 DR, and it took several different guises throughout its existence, and would come to terrorize the inhabitants of the Moonshae Isles until it was defeated. Then it would bide its time and draw power from the Moonwell so that it could rise again in a few years and start all over, causing a vicious cycle of violence. And I just want to get ahead of this by saying that there are some serious discrepancies with Khazgoroth. In earlier sources, Khazgoroth is cited as being an aspect of Malar, the god of beasts that we mentioned before. And considering that Khazgoroth is typically depicted as a T-Rex or other beasts and had the ability to inflict lycanthropy, it would make sense that it would actually be an aspect of Malar rather than the avatar of Bhaal. But all later sources state that it was an avatar or minion of Bhaal. And avatar here seems to allude to being an agent of Bhaal rather than a form that Bhaal himself would take. But it's still described as an avatar throughout the sources, so I figured it would make some amount of sense to put in here. Plus, we get to learn about all the discrepancies in the word avatar and how it can mean many different things. Speaking of minions of Bhaal, however, the clergy were known as Baalis or Balin in lands east of the Dragon Reach. The church was very disorganized, having no set structure or hierarchy, and what little order they had was different from church to church. But while they were a bit distant from each other, they all collectively agreed that murder was their favorite hobby, as it was their gods. Each cleric was expected to murder at least one person every week, and the holy symbol of his church was a skull surrounded by a ring of bloody droplets. And just like Bane, Bhaal had his fair share of adversaries within the pantheon. Chief among those was Chanti, the goddess of life, and I don't think it takes too much imagination to figure out why the god of murder might have it out for the goddess of life and bounty. He also had it out with Helm, Ilmater, Lathander, Lyra, and Tyr, all of which were lawful or good or both. Those who he served and worked with were Talona, the goddess of poison, and Loviatar, the goddess of agony, whom Bane also worked with. In turn, he also apparently worked for Bane, and by worked for, I mean was probably enslaved or indentured in some way. But serving him was an imp butler named Kespinar, who would do his bidding for him. And that brings us right around to Myrkul, the new god of the dead. He was also known as the Lord of Bones, Old Lord Skull, the Reaper, and the Deathless Lord of Death. His portfolio was that of death, decay, old age, exhaustion, dusk, and autumn. All things that revolved around or were close to death. And being associated with death and being a former necromancer, his alignment was neutral evil. And I think it's interesting to note at this point that we have almost the full spectrum of evil aligned members in the Dead 3, but we never see chaotic evil. I feel like if anyone could have filled that slot and rounded out the table, it could have been Bhaal. Bane had too strict of a set of rules that he followed, hence being lawful evil. And Myrkul, being the god of the dead, I can see neutral evil being associated with, although I think that since death is impartial and it comes for us all in the end, a good god of the dead would have been true neutral. I understand that Myrkul's mortal life as a right bastard comes into play here, so his alignment does make sense. Bhaal being the god of murder feels like he would have been a good candidate for the chaotic evil slot, especially considering everything we talked about with his avatars and general disorganization of his church, but I digress. The avatar of Myrkul appeared as a skeleton of a man in flowing black robes who was on the brink of death, with leathery skin and cracked black lips. He spoke in a high whisper, and his voice was said to have been higher and softer than you'd expect, and spoke in a monotonous tone showing no emotion. When this avatar showed up in the realms, a mere touch from him could disrupt the life force of non-divine beings. It could also siphon away their strength or inflict mummy rot on them. Mummy rot was basically a death sentence and would slowly rot away the victim until they died in a maximum of probably 6 months. On the flip side, as you would expect from a necromancer, Myrkul could also use his touch to reanimate a being into an undead. And this all falls under the fact that Myrkul wanted people to be aware of death at all times and have it directly in the back of their mind. He was a bit of an egotist as the god of death and would do his best to make sure that he was remembered with every word and action causing general unease to remind the world that death was waiting for them and that he would be the one to greet them in the end. And surprisingly, he was not very popular amongst worshippers. While his rule inspired the dread of death, and that was exactly it was dread, there was very little love for Myrkul, and because he was associated with the feeling of dread, there were very few who decided to truly worship him. I think most people were probably happy to try their best to forget him, despite Myrkul's best efforts. But those who did worship him were called Myrkulites, and were often undertakers in one form or another. They were tasked with ensuring that Toril both feared and respected death, and because of the mummy's wrought touch of Myrkul, the priests often spread rumors that touching one of their priests would do the same, and tried to carry out that same fear, although it was nothing more than a rumor, and they didn't possess the same power of their god. The holy symbol of these worshippers was a white skull inset into a black triangle. One kind of neat and noteworthy part of their church is that the clerics would travel about the realms offering burial and funeral services for a fee. When called upon, they would do anything in their power to make the affected comfortable with the idea of death, and were there to assure their family members or friends or whomever was there that the deceased had a peaceful transition from life to death. They were also responsible in those cases that they were hired to carry out the remaining affairs of the deceased, such as last wills and testaments. One could even pay out a skull fee to have a cleric of Myrkul carry out their unfinished business after their death, such as things that they could not have completed in their life or final arrangements for their death. I tried to find out what a skull fee is, but I can't find out any more than it was likely paid by the person who was to be deceased rather than by their next of kin after they had already passed. And whether or not there was an actual skull used in the transaction is also kind of unclear, but I think it might be actually very literal, honestly, and it might have meant that the cleric had the right to take the deceased skull after business was done. They do seem like an odd bunch after all, and I wouldn't put it past them to bring skulls back to the church and make some sort of macabre sculpture or church out of them. And just like the other members of the Dead Three, he had his share of foes and allies. It says here that he had a complicated kinship with Bane and Bhaal, both in his mortal and god life, which I think is interesting, but it makes sense. They were used as a means to an end for Myrkul to gain the throne of Bone and become the god of death. So I don't imagine it was exactly a friendship, but more of a working relationship. Another deity that was counted amongst his allies was Shar, which I also think makes sense. His enemies were Chanti, Lathander, and Mieliki, the goddess of forests. An interesting choice there, but he likely had many other foes, and these are just the ones that were listed. And that's all I really have to say on the Dead Three at this point. I think that's a good overview of their personalities, avatars, and churches, so now we can get into their lives as the Dead Three and answer that question. I think it's worth noting at this point that all three members were considered gods and were deities in their own respects, but they were not gods as much as you would consider the originals like Chanti, Tyr, or any major gods. They were known as quasi-deities. This meant that they held all of the powers of a divine being, but they were not as strong as others. It was almost like being a demigod, which I think is the best way I can really describe it. And funnily enough, demigod is the lowest tier of a quasi-deity. So they were more than a demigod, but they were basically demigods. Their existence was that of a mortal and deity being intertwined, since they were once mortal, and they found a way to ascend to godhood. However, if a quasi-deity was able to amass enough followers, they could actually transcend into being a fully fledged god. I don't think that any of the Dead Three achieved this, though. I think they remained quasi-deities. So let's actually talk about the Dead Three. As deities, they reigned over their respective realms for centuries. Bane spread hate and tyrannical rule all throughout Faerun and inspired a network of thralls in the Zentarum, also known as the Black Network, which was a mercenary company full of spies, assassins, thieves, and wizards who were indentured by their leaders to service Bane. He would become one of the most detested deities across the continent, and he wasn't very popular as a result. Myrkul was actually also in the same boat where most people feared him too much to pay respect to him, so neither of them really saw widespread worship. But Myrkul was given offerings at funeral services as the god of the dead, so at least he didn't fade into obscurity. Bhaal, on the other hand, became a god of immense power despite being a loser in their game to be gods. He was able to use his murder hobo wiles to the most effect, being the god of death and murder. In the year of clinging death, 75 DR, the great seer Alondo arrived at the library fortress of Candlekeep, where he told monks of his prophecies. One of these prophecies was a vision that Bhaal would become aware of his imminent death and ensure his legacy by sowing seeds all across Faerun, with little to no respect for his partners, Bane and Myrkul. And this actually turned out to be true, and by the mid-14th century DR, Bhaal would have sired a score of mortal progeny in his Bhaal spawn. This would ensure his legacy went on after him in the event of his death. And we'll fast forward to that time in the Time of Troubles in 1358 DR, which I know I've mentioned a few times on this podcast, and it's hard not to talk about it when you're writing about the gods and their history, as it was such a prolific event. And now we finally get to dive into the full story because, wouldn't you know it, Bane and Myrkul were at the head of it. After seeing how well Bhaal was doing, Bane and Myrkul desired more power. Like I said before, if a quasi-deity could amass a large enough following, they could become a fully fledged god. And this is likely what they were seeking. So Bane and Myrkul conspired to steal the Tablets of Fate from Lord Au. And if you don't know, Au was essentially the figurehead of the deities. He was known as the Overgod, and all deities and primordials, no matter who they were or what they were subject to him. In essence, he was the god of gods. And the Tablets of Fate were powerful artifacts in the form of stone slabs that served to maintain the balance of laws and chaos. They also contained the names of all deities. So theoretically, if you were to strike out one of the names of the deities or the portfolios that were listed on the tablets, you could change the order of things. So having access to these tablets was monumental, and if Bane and Myrkul were able to grab a hold of them, there's no saying what they could do. And honestly, there's almost nothing they couldn't do. So, of course, Au was not having any of this. He was fed up with gods being locked in a habitual power struggle that prevented them from being able to carry out their duties as deities towards their mortal faithful. After all, a god's duties were to the mortals that walked the realms, and everything that the gods did should have been in service to the mortals, as Au thought. But as was evident by Bane and Myrkul trying to steal the Tablets of Fate in an attempt to rewrite the balance of law and chaos, the gods just seemed doomed to repeat the same mistakes of their forebears. And so Au decreed that every god, with the exception of Helm, who was to guard the gates of the heavens, would be forced to walk among the mortals without their divine powers in an attempt to humble them. The immediate repercussions were that no divine power worked as intended anymore. If a faithful called forth for divine aid, they would get nothing in return unless they were within 1 mile radius to their deity, and even then, they wouldn't necessarily get what they wanted. And I'm sure you can see the flaws in this already. As a secondary result of this, Mystra was no longer able to maintain control over the arcane magic that she presided over with the Weave, and it became dangerously unpredictable. So not only did this mean that she couldn't control it, but magic users could not necessarily control the Weave. And this is a very, very, very bad thing if you know anything about magic. The third and possibly most dangerous repercussion is that the gods were now walking the earth with no way to abscond from their avatar forms. If there was ever a time to kill a god, it was right now when they were stripped of their powers and truly vulnerable for the first time to mortals. Of course, walking the realms as an avatar without powers didn't stop Bane and Myrkul from wanting to steal the Tablets of Fate. But to do so, they would need more firepower than ever. So they contacted Bhaal, and they had him get in on the fun too. And the three were on course to cause some havoc. Bane rallied the Zentarum and the members of his clergy to begin hunt for the tablets. He began with an assault on the town of Shadowdale, which ended with a battle with Mystra, the goddess of magic, and Elminster, one of the most powerful wizards alive. However, the Weave wasn't exactly working as intended, as I mentioned before, so both of them were a shell of what they were capable of. So thankfully for them, they had plenty of help. Or at least Elminster did, because Bane managed to slay Mystra and learned of the location of one of these tablets, which was in the city of Tantris in the Temple of Torm's Coming, guarded by Torm himself. Myrkul was busy on the western side of Faerun after being defeated in battle, where he learned of the location of another one of the tablets and sought to bring it to his realm of the Grey Waste of Hades. However, to get to the other tablet guarded by Torm, they knew that they were going to need to work together to take down the Guardian. So Myrkul and his clergy worked on a mass-scale death spell in a scheme that could give Bane more power. With this spell and the names of all of the assassins in Faerun, thanks to Bhaal, they were able to kill scores of Bhaal's followers in a single moment, while the priests of Bane performed a ceremony that was known as the Stealing of Souls, and this is exactly what it sounds like. They were able to harness the power of the ungodly amount of people who had just died by the hands of Myrkul. I wondered this for a moment, but very quickly came to the conclusion and realized that it made plenty of sense. Why did they kill Bhaal's minions? And why was Bhaal okay with it? And then I realized, of course, Bhaal is the god of murder, and he doesn't give a shake of a dog's tail whether his followers die or not, because murder is what keeps him going. Of course, Bhaal is willing to sacrifice a bunch of his minions for the sake of their goal. Plus, he had the largest following, so I'm sure that even with these deaths, he was still probably the most worshipped out of the three. But what was this all for? What were they siphoning the power of souls for? Well, they transferred the essence of these souls into Bane, and he was transferred from his avatar into the massively armored statue made of black glass, or obsidian, known as the Black Brother. This was exactly the edge that they needed to get past Torm and get the remaining tablet. And so Bane went towards the city of Tantris to confront the titan-sized, lion-headed Torm. Torm, as well, had been empowered by the souls of his clergy, who sacrificed themselves willingly at his temples at their god's request. This was unexpected, but Bane wasn't going to just back down now, so they engaged in a massive fight. This caused unprecedented damage to the city, took down buildings, tore up earth from the ground, and caused general disorder. But in the end, they destroyed one another in a brilliant explosion caused by the two clashing, and they were both dead. Meanwhile, a mortal Zentarum thief named Cyric had learned of what the three gods of death were doing and decided to rally his fellow soldiers to do the same. With a group of adventurers, Cyric was able to get a hold of one of the tablets and made his way across the Sea of Fallen Stars to the city of Waterdeep. Of course, the two remaining gods, Bhaal and Myrkul, sniffed this out and learned that one of them had the tablets in their possession and sent out minions to intercept them. Cyric was able to escape and met up with more of his comrades. He explained to them what was going on and that the two gods were on his tail trying to get the tablet from him, and this sparked the plan to get their hands on the other tablet so that he and his companion, Midnight, could take advantage of the situation at hand to ascend themselves to godhood. The avatar of Bhaal managed to track them down to the High Horn Hold, where they trapped him in amber and were able to escape, but not before learning that the other tablet was taken by Myrkul already and was held in his fortress in the Grey Wastes. Being trapped in amber didn't hold the god of murder for long, and Bhaal was able to escape after a time and continue his hunt, where he found them camped out. Bhaal began killing everything, soldiers and their horses, so that they couldn't escape. He was able to kill a large score of them before being hit with a lightning bolt from Midnight, which hurt him greatly. He focused his attention on Midnight, and just as he was advancing, Cyric managed to use his thief skills to sneak up and plunge his sword into the back of the avatar of Bhaal, killing him. Cyric and his companions were able to regroup in Waterdeep, knowing that there was only one of the three left, Myrkul. And while Myrkul didn't particularly care for his companions that had just died, he did care about the tablets, and so he couldn't just let them go. So Myrkul was able to use one of the tablets that he did have to create a portal into Waterdeep that connected Hades and Toril, and was able to funnel legions of undead into the city. In the chaos, Myrkul was able to obtain the second tablet of fate, and, while he was attempting to escape with both of them, was thwarted by Midnight and her growing magical abilities. And Myrkul was forced to fight her and her allies directly to secure the tablet once again. But while he was distracted by a griffin rider that flew close overhead, Midnight was able to use Disintegrate on the god of the dead, and his withered body drifted across the sky from the Blackstaff Tower, and so, the three gods of death were dead. And it was all their fault. If they hadn't colluded to steal the tablets from Au would have never cast all the gods down to walk the realms in their avatar forms. And if they weren't in that position, Cyric and Midnight probably wouldn't have been able to kill Bhaal and Myrkul, and Bane wouldn't have died fighting Torm. And this is where we get the nickname, the Dead Three, the three gods of death killed by their own folly. And this is also the time of troubles. That's the end of that story, really. There's a lot else that happened in that time with other gods, and even with Elminster. Elminster played a huge part in that. But that's another story for another time. And you might be wondering, this was before the events of Baldur's Gate 3, so how could this be possible? How could they be dead? And that's the funny thing about death in the D&D universe, is that it seems to be more of an inconvenience than anything else. Cyric was able to ascend to the throne of bone, the bone throne, as the god of death, which was then bestowed upon Kelemvor after him. So they held the portfolios that were held by Myrkul, Bane, and Bhaal. So Myrkul wasn't able to weasel his way back into the Pantheon, but he was able to keep a piece of himself that wasn't absorbed by Cyric into the Crown of Horns, which was an ancient Netherese artifact. And he was able to come back in a more limited form in the 15th century DR, where he was basically forced to share his aspect with Jergal, who was acting as seneschal to Kelemvor, the current god of the dead at this point. And at that point, he was able to remain a quasi-deity in mortal form, but he wasn't the true god of dead anymore. Bhaal, as I mentioned before, was able to maintain his legacy through his vast progeny, the Bhaalspawn. While many of his clergy in urban areas ended up worshipping Cyric, who took the portfolios of all of them after murdering them, there were still plenty in rural areas who worshipped him instead of Cyric as their only Lord of Murder. After most of his Bhaalspawn were dead, he was able to resurrect through their power, which was his plan all along. Bhaal was also a being of quasi-divine status at this point, basically being a strong mortal who ended up getting his domain back from Cyric. So he was kind of in the same position he was before his death. Bane was the only one who was able to really truly circumvent his death and managed to come back within a decade of being killed. He had anticipated that he might meet his end, and so he created a scion for the purpose of his regeneration. His half-mortal son, Yaptujim, and I'm sure I butchered that as well, was nothing more than a cocoon to hold his father's divinity within himself until Bane was ready to literally burst forth from his chest and regenerate. But after the events of the Second Sundering and the Spell Plague, Bane was left as a quasi-deity in mortal form along with his brothers in death, Myrkul and Bhaal. So, the three at this point were essentially just really powerful mortals, and they were still quasi-deities, but I would actually call them demigods at this point, with maybe the exception of Bhaal, who was able to get back his portfolios and kind of maintain a position of power. But they were all able to reclaim parts of themselves that were stolen by Cyric in one way or another, and were able to reestablish themselves in their respective clergies. And that would bring us to the absolute crisis in the 15th century DR. The Dead Three had all chosen their champions within Baldur's Gate in an attempt to take over the city and bring themselves back to their former glory and more. If you remember when I said way back when that if a quasi-deity was able to get enough followers, they could actually be granted full godhood, and I think that was the plan. Bane had chosen Lord Enver Gortash, Bhaal had the Dark Urge, and Ketheric Thorm was the supplicant of Myrkul. These three would do work for the Dead Three to bring them back to power and to terrorize the city of Baldur's Gate. Lord Gortash and the Dark Urge formulated a plot that would allow for their respective gods to commit an unholy number of murders in Baldur's Gate and beyond. They stole the crown of Karsus from the Archdevil Mephistopheles, which they forced onto an illithid elderbrain that ruled over a colony in the Underdark in the Moonrise Towers. They manipulated the elderbrain into supplanting tadpoles into the brains of countless Faerunians, but with a catch. That the infected would not immediately undergo seromorphosis, but rather the tadpole would lay in wait until the time was right, when everyone who was infected would transform at once. These infected were basically given a telepathic link to the brain who served as a divine entity known as the Absolute, hence the Absolute Crisis. While this was happening, Ketheric Thorm was working in the Moonrise Towers with Myrkul to raise an army of the undead that would march upon Baldur's Gate. The plan was, when that happened, Lord Gortash would be there with his Steel Watch, an army of automatons, to save the day and formally take over Baldur's Gate as the city's savior. Meanwhile, everyone turning into mind flayers at the drop of a dime would add to the chaos and bring about numerous deaths, which the Dead Three could siphon power from the released souls, or so they thought. It turns out that's not how that works at all, and mind flayers don't have souls. which meant that when hundreds or thousands of people suddenly turned into mind flayers, the Dead Three would still gain no benefit, and seeing as undead didn't have souls either, Myrkul's undead plot was moot as well. So, the only thing they really had going for them in this plot was that, by technicality, they were all getting plenty of followers, which did bolster their power. See, the people who were implanted with the tadpoles were hearing the voice of what they called the Absolute, which was really just the Elder Brain that was being controlled by the Dead Three via the Crown of Karsus. But since the cult of the Absolute recognized the Absolute as a divine voice speaking to them, it became some sort of religious cult. And because they were worshipping the Absolute, which was really just an Elder Brain, which was actually just the Dead Three, they were being inadvertently worshipped, which was enough for the cult of the Absolute to be considered their followers, which is a wild concept, really. But as we know, they were thwarted during the events of Baldur's Gate 3, or I would assume so, at least. I don't think there's a canon ending to Baldur's Gate 3, and so I don't think we can say for sure what happened until the next game or module that continues the story comes out. So, going over the events in the game feels like a bit of a moot point as well, since there's so many things that can happen in the game and we don't know what's considered the right option. I would personally think that the redeemed Dark Urge is probably the way to go. That seems like it would be the canon ending. I don't think that full Dark Urge would be the canon ending, since that's basically just, killing everything and taking over, but I think that probably redeemed Dark Urge is going to be the canon if they actually decide that one is canon. And so that brings us to the end of this episode about the Dead Three, Bane, Bhaal, and Myrkul. And that means I get to ask my favorite question, which is, what did you think? Do you think that the Dead Three would have maintained their positions as gods if they didn't instigate the Time of Troubles? Or who do you think was the strongest among the three? It seems like Bhaal ended up doing the best despite losing in the game of Knucklebones, but does that necessarily make him the strongest? He had the most followers, but bigger number doesn't necessarily mean better person. So, we'll see, I guess. What do you think? You can find us online at Lore to Death on your favorite social media apps, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. We're also on YouTube, so if you head over there and hit subscribe, I would really appreciate it. If you have any questions or suggestions for topics, please send me a message wherever you can find me, or at loretodeth@gmail.com. And if you're using the Spotify app, there is a comment section attached to the episode where you can submit any questions or topics. If you're on YouTube, you know what to do. Drop a comment. I would love to hear from you guys. And remember, don't reach too far. It's okay to be happy with what you have, and there's no point giving into the hustle culture just so you can become the god of gods. If you're in a comfortable position, it's okay to just settle down and simply exist. We're only here for a short time, so make the best of it, lest you get stabbed in the back or disintegrated atop a tower. Disintegration is not a way you want to go. And I'll lure you to death in the next one. See ya.